We're going to go ahead and get started. Michelle will be back momentarily. She's on the hunt for a seat cushion. All right, so our next panel is going to be moderated by our fellow Gabe Collins, who's on the previous panel. And this panel is going to cover the multifaceted nature of sustainability. So we are going to be talking about all three pillars of sustainability and how they're woven together. So, Gabe, I will let you have it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rachel. So just as basically run of show and points of order is each one of these folks will have 5 to 7 minutes, telling you about kind of how they interface with sustainability and how it's playing into their research. And then after that, we'll turn to Q&A. Now, the part that Ken didn't tell you in his introduction to me in the last panels, I'm also a lawyer by training, so I can ask infinite questions, but I really don't want to do that. And so if you guys, as you hear them talk and think of questions, basically the minute we're done there, feel free to jump in, because it's much better if y'all ask them than me. But without further ado, Ted, if you'd like to get started.
Yeah, thanks, Gabe, and thanks for the opportunity. Thanks all of you for being here. This is going to be more of a 30,000 feet view, that of a macroeconomist. And I'm honored to hold the George and Cynthia Mitchell Chair in Sustainable Development here at the Economics Department at Rice University. So I'll tell you a little bit about sustainable development. First of all, what is development? Development refers to economic growth and the increase in living standards, especially these days in what is termed the Global South. There's something really interesting. If you look at all indices of living standards, for example, related to life expectancy, you see something completely flat from virtually the introduction of humanity, and as far back as we have even primitive data, all the way to the Industrial Revolution. And then you see sort of exponential growth in these living standards. These days you hear a lot about limits to growth. From the sustainable development point of view, this is very much a global north perspective. And there's still a lot, and I'll say a little bit about that in the next few minutes, there's still a lot of growth that needs to actually take place in the global south. Of course, economic growth requires enormous amounts of energy. And traditionally, this energy has been provided through fossil fuel sources. We're now in the midst of an energy transition. And another thing I will mention briefly, and then I can elaborate further, is that this is not going to be a 0-1, where unless fusion, which is consistently 20 years away, regardless of the calendar year, it will at some point, but until then, this is going to be a mix, and it's not going to be a 0-1 transition. Now, this is the development part, the growth part. What about the sustainable? So sustainable development recognizes two things. The first is that economic activity takes place in the biosphere. And this traditional economic development it's more of an afterthought there. But sustainable development emphasizes that. And there is a big back and forth between the services, sometimes called ecosystem services, that we receive from our environment. This includes things like the role of biodiversity, water purification, forests acting as carbon sinks, even things like pollination, which are incredibly valuable for our well-being. So that's one aspect, and there's this back and forth between economic activity that benefits us, but also the being able to preserve these activities that are also essential to our well-being. And the second aspect is that development and increase in living standards for our generation, and of course our multiple generations represented in this room, should not come at the cost of lowering the living standards for future generations. So that's the second sort of pillar, if you want, of sustainable development. That is something that considers not only us who are alive today, but the future versions of ourselves as well. These trade-offs, sustainability, economics, and economic development is first and foremost, it's economics. So we evaluate these trade-offs carefully. And it's, as I said, it's not going to be a 0-1 thing. One example that I want to mention is an issue that takes sometimes second stage to climate change and the implications of climate change for human well-being, but I think it's a personal thing. It's as important, and that's the notion of and the problem, the huge problem of energy poverty. There are over 1 billion people, billion with a B, on the planet. Most of them in sub-Saharan Africa, some in Asia and South America, who have unreliable or no access to electricity. And of course, when I mention this to my class, immediately people reach for the cell phones because they think that's where the problem would be if you use electricity. But as you can imagine, absent, when you live in energy poverty, biomass, burning wood is used for cooking. This has huge effects, especially for young women who are very involved in this activity. There are life expectancy, well-documented life expectancy effects from this. In energy poverty, it's hard to purify water, it's hard to store effectively food and life-saving medication. So this is a challenge. And as we are getting energy, the need for this part of the population, the world population, to have reliable access to energy, what would be the profile, the energy profile that will make that possible? One of the things that comes out of the economic analysis of this is that it's not going to be a 0-1 solution. It's something that will take time, and it's also something that will be a mix. And I think I'll leave it. Did I overuse my 5 minutes?
Oh, no.
Okay.
I'm just laughing at Michelle's new seat cushion there. Yeah, no, you were all good.
Okay. Sorry, I'll leave it at that, Gabe, and I can come back as questions.
You're good. You've got a couple more minutes.
The last thing that I want to mention is, it's always tempting to argue about doing something, and policies are beneficial when they come as a result of thoughtful analysis, and in economics, cost-benefit analysis. One of the things that has proved somewhat counterproductive is having governments step in and picking winners. For example, picking technologies that we might think that these are technologies that have a frontier at that point in time, but that might be a bad idea in the long term. One example that comes to mind, I'll leave you with that, is the Europeans in the audience at least recognized that at some point Europe took the diesel car and picked it as being the winner technology, very concerned about climate change and so on, until other problems were identified. It's a terrific technology, diesel automobiles. It proved not to be the winner ultimately. Policy reversed, and now incentives are provided and have been provided in recent years to sort of downgrade that technology, the representation of that technology in Europe as well. So it's a cautionary tale about policy, and that's partly the reason why economists favor policies such as carbon tax that evens the field, and it's hard to implement, admittedly, especially this day and age. The word tax is fatal in many contexts, but governments are not particularly good at picking winners and evening the field and have the market picking the winning technologies is something that, again, comes out of our modeling as the winning strategy. And I'll leave it at that. Happy to take questions to anything related. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle?
Are we introducing ourselves? I guess
Please.
we're doing that.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
so
I'm outsourcing all of it. So.
we're outsourcing everything. So I'm Michelle Foss. I'm really happy to be with all of you here today, friends, family, and all of that, to join us in this conversation. Just a quick point about myself. I'm older than everybody who's been up here before, except with maybe the exception of Benigna. I can't remember whether we're the same age or but we're close. We're about.
You have a better
gracious.
Seat than all of us.
But so I'm going to talk about things that span like 50 years of work experience, and I just wanted to mention that. I also I started out in the sciences, biology and geology, and worked for a number of years in environmental science, doing some of the stuff that Peter talked about, remediation of mine land sites. Discovered, I guess in my case, the economics gene, and ended up at the Colorado School of Mines. So I spent a lot of early years around the mining industry. That's come up a bit. Minerals, that word has come up a bit. And then took the big fork in the road and spent all of the rest of my career in oil, gas, LNG, electric power, and all of that, which are all political. And so I was helped by the final degree in political science, which is a mess, by the way, as a discipline. So I just wanted to give y'all that context. Materials future is in the title of the forum today. So for this panel, we're going to get to that a little bit, and Benigna's going to add to it. And I want to play a little bit on what our colleague said before and what Ted just brought up. And I want to start by giving you an example of a materials transition that I saw firsthand. So I'm a young junior professional. By this time, I'm actually at Mines in Colorado doing my economics degree. And I'm hosting a group of folks from Washington in Wyoming, which in those days was pretty funny by itself. But at any rate, we're at Medicine Bow, which is a beautiful part of Wyoming, one of my favorite parts. And we're at the first nascent experimental wind power location on Bureau of Land Management land. This is how we kind of got the business started in the United States. And so there are these two turbines. This is the state of the wind industry in the United States, plus a little bit of what was going on at Lawrence Livermore in those days and a few other things. And everybody's scrambling up and down to go into the nacelles of the turbines and see what this is all about and everything else. Those wind power projects, those two instruments, the blades were made of stainless steel. They were 8 tons apiece. So my favorite question to ask to audiences is, what do we make wind turbine blades of now? Glass. Okay, actually the first thing, because obviously 8 tons of stainless steel isn't going to get you far if you're trying to build a wind power industry, right? So the next thing was balsa wood cores with plastics. That raised all kinds of sustainability issues because of where balsa comes from, equatorial forests and so on in places like Ecuador where nobody is happy about extracting balsa. So we started using fiberglass with thermoplastics, and that's pretty much where we are today with lots of coatings to try to get these things to last because they have a bad habit of not lasting very long. The point of this is economics lesson number 1. How is it that you can put plastic into wind turbine blades to begin with? By having a chemicals industry that can make plastics cheaply enough so that you can consider doing this kind of stuff. And that industry also puts out a lot of other things. The plastics that we worry about when it comes to waste and recycling and all of that sort of thing. And so I think it's useful for people to think about that. Scale is really important. It really matters in terms of making things affordable. And probably the biggest challenge going forward into new technologies for energy or ideas people have about what's sustainable or not sustainable is this reality. You get the cost down on a unit basis by building large economies of scale. And that is important to remember as we go along. The second example of energy transitions, because this is one that everybody talks about all the time. Human beings went from wood to coal and coal-like materials to oil, and then supposedly the future was going to be gas or, maybe wind and solar. But except for this problem that Peter pointed out, which is energy density declines when you go to intermittent sources of power like wind and solar. And even gas is kind of a problem because it's a gas. So we like natural gas, methane, because it's cleaner when we use it for power generation. But it's really inconvenient to compress and try to get into a vehicle, right? So there's a trade-off there. That back to, economics lesson number 2. There are lots of trade-offs in these transitions, to Ted's point, that we get into. One of the harsh realities, lesson number 3, as we get into kind of this talk about materials transitions for energy transitions, what does that really mean? The popular ideas are, of course, we're going to fill the world up with intermittent sources of electricity, balance it with battery energy storage, and we can also put that into vehicles, and we're going to do mobility, electrified mobility, right? Okay, so when things are lower in energy density, they go up in materials intensity. So in 2017, at kind of, a formative period, the World Bank rolls out a report on what it's actually going to take in materials to be able to achieve the energy transition that everybody wants to talk about. And it's tons and tons and tons of stuff, because think about it. If you're going to build wind and solar facilities and you're going to put batteries is the black box in the solution of balancing the electric power system, the energy system, boy, you're sure going to need a lot of material for that. There is nothing more intense than making batteries. That is one of the more energy intense and materials intense things that human beings can do. But that's the discussion. If you're going to put batteries into vehicles for mobility and you want the world to run that way, that means replacing roughly 1.5 billion passenger vehicles. So to the numbers that Gabe talked about, they sound big. 2% of of passenger vehicles today roughly is electrified. China, in their vehicle fleet, it's a little higher, right? But globally, that's about the number. And it's been kind of static because we're constantly turning over inventory and people are replacing vehicles and all that kind of stuff. So some people have done the math. I haven't, but you can go to other sources and you can see the estimates of materials to supply enough batteries with replacement and maintenance and everything else to replace 1.5 billion passenger vehicles if you really want to electrify mobility. But you can't do just that, of course. Remember, you have the electric power system with all the pieces, parts of the electric power system that has to come together and all the materials that have to go into that to make sure it all works, right? Are you following my points as I go along here? Because now we wake up to where, I come onto the scene here, post-retirement entertainment from the University of Texas to help Ken and the group build some awareness of mining, metals, and minerals, and how that fits into material streams for the energy program. And we're on the cusp of yet another discovery, which is that actually nobody likes talking about all the tons of material that we need. So this has become quite unpopular. So at a time when we're trying to revitalize the mining industry in the United States and globally and deal with all of the sustainability issues in mining, of which there are a ton, we also don't like it very much. And we especially don't like the parts of it that I had some experience with, and that is the processing of the minerals in order to get to the metals that we're really interested in the first place. In fact, in the United States, what we've done is a really good job of dismantling that and sending it overseas. And now we're trying to figure out how on earth do we get back something that actually people didn't really want in the first place. And it's not that we can't do it. We can do it, and we can do it well, and we can do it with the right regulatory oversight. That's one of the arguments for doing this in the US, in fact, is our practices and regulatory oversight. But it's expensive. So we come back to the financial sustainability side of things, and every estimate, and this is before the discussion of tariffs, that people were looking at to try to reshore something. We're going to add an aluminum smelter. We're going to try to return some zinc smelting. We're going to try to, do a better job of metals and metals fabrication so that we can do some of this at home and not be as vulnerable to supply chain disruptions and other things. And the costs double and triple in no time. And it's labor. That's an easily identified variable. It's the cost of capital. That's an easily identified variable. And it's the cost of materials themselves and everything associated with the regulatory oversight of that. So here we are, in which we're going to rebuild energy systems with stuff that nobody wants and nobody can pay for a mining industry that struggles with that third leg of the stool, financial sustainability. These are really low margin businesses. These are boom-bust businesses, classic boom-bust businesses. And they're also very old businesses. So when we look at the assets around today, for every one of the metals that we're interested in, along with the byproducts and co-products, we're looking at stuff that's been in operation for a long time. And that's not unusual. You build a mine. We look at the major mines in Chile, for instance. Escondida, which is the biggest copper mine in the world, has been in operation since the 90s. But just like everything else, you're depleting the resource. So the mine remains in business, but the ore grades decline as the mine remains in business, and you pretty soon hit a wall on whether or not you can continue to operate, plus pay for all of the sustainability improvements that people want you to make. So this is a real conundrum that really doesn't get enough discussion or illustration as people talk about all of this. We also have, kind of related to that, a desire by the mining industry to get premiums if they do sign on to things that people consider important for greening up metals production, like changing energy sources, for instance. So we're in this kind of funny situation in which high-quality aluminum smelters that already are operated, or steel furnaces that already are operated by subsidized hydroelectricity, those producers want the same green premium as somebody who's trying to just switch off of diesel or something else, coal, to be able to put that metal product into the market and be able to say, well, this is a green metal product. So the last point, and I'm going to set up the next panel, and a colleague who's in the audience, Matteo Pascali, who we've been working with, we look at all of this, and the question is, well, what if we go back to the beginning? So everybody worries about carbon taxing, carbon pricing, because of the combustion of carbon, but carbon also is integral to materials. So what if we take the carbon footprint and we just do something different with it? So here at Rice, we have the invention of carbon nanotube materials. We have the invention of deriving fibers from carbon nanotube materials. If I can end up with a product using that can compete with copper, why not? Or if I can put that into a composite that can compete with aluminum, why not? For aerospace and other applications, it makes huge sense. So when we talk about materials futures, we really need to talk about that part of things a lot more, I think, in this big sphere of sustainability than we have been. And I really think that as a team, that's where we're trying to head and where we should head going forward. So there you are, your turn.
Yeah, Benigna, it's you. Yeah, Michelle, if you guys can fabricate those parts, I'll give you specs for things on my truck, and I'll be your test bed.
We're on it.
Well, with that, Benigna, please.
Yes. Well, I am Benigna Lice, and I'm a non-resident fellow here at the Baker Institute. Before that, I was working for Chevron, where I retired, and then I came here to work primarily on, at the time, it was on Mexico, because my last job in Chevron, I was the person responsible for Mexico and Latin America in many various capacities. But here, I have been collaborating with Michelle and with another colleague, Tilsa, that are very interested in minerals and materials. And I have been focusing on the Southern Cone, meaning South America, that our colleague here, Francisco, mentioned. And the fact is that, yes, Latin America and the Southern Cone, they have plenty of countries, many countries, which we always think in terms that they're very similar, and that's true, but they're also very different. And I'm going to be focusing on the different countries, particularly in the ones that produce these minerals that are critical for the energy transition. And that is, as you may have seen in the news, is copper and lithium. And in addition to that, we have also been doing some work on hydrogen that Jim mentioned that the countries in the Gulf are so intent on producing, and there is a combination or a similarity with the conditions in Chile, particularly because of the desert. Chile has the driest desert in the world, even drier than in Saudi Arabia and Oman, those countries. So they really have very good sun. Therefore, they have been generating plenty of solar power, which is very interesting because that has generated other issues, as we have been discussing here. So the reality of the countries that we have been focusing on in particular are Peru and Chile, that are the two major producers of copper in the world. They are the major exporters and producers of copper. And then we have also been looking at Argentina and Brazil because of lithium, and that is another product, and also Brazil because of their interest in hydrogen. So that has been, I guess, the focus for the work I have been doing. And in this whole concept of sustainability, the role of the indigenous communities has become critical because they have the power to stop projects, new projects. If local communities and indigenous communities, if they are not being consulted, or if they're not being happy with the consequences and implications of having a mining operation in their territories, they can actually stop the project. So it is very critical for the investors to be aware of this, and at the same time to figure out how they can manage the situation. And the fact is that these communities have become very well informed on what it takes to develop a mining project, from exploration to development and to operation, and then to actually shut down the mining operation once the resource is depleted. So they have become very significant rather than being observers of what is happening with the mining activity. Many of these groups have organized themselves and become partners, really become partners of the project, because they know what they need and they want to be partners, and at the same time they have requirements about participating in the revenues that are being generated by these projects if they're successful. As Michelle was mentioning, the reality is that some of these projects take a long time to figure out, first, if they're going to be successful, and secondly, the infrastructure and the significant capital investment that it takes to develop this project. So it's not something that they can rely, an investor cannot rely on saying, we are going to just do this. They have to do really a very thorough risk analysis in terms of the opportunity to develop that project on one hand, and then the exploration it doesn't ensure that they are going to find the product that they are looking for. So as I said, this is a very challenging area, but at the same time, these countries have been very successful in attracting investors, particularly in the case of, as I said before, in the case of Peru and Chile on the copper side. However, the investors have learned that they have to work with the communities. And on the lithium side, there has been a very interesting development in the case of Chile and Argentina, which are, as I said, similar countries, but very different because they have a different government structure. One is a federal government, and the other one, it has a provincial organization. Therefore, the provinces are the ones that have the control of what happens in their territories, while in the federal government, it's the central government that decides what are going to be the rules and regulations. So in that case, in the case of Chile, it's the central government. Therefore, the projects, the approval process and the regulatory framework and the policies that apply usually take a lot longer to be decided. In the case of the provinces, which is the case of Argentina with the lithium that has increased the production recently, is because the provinces are very interested in those projects to be developed faster. So that in terms of the overall picture of that area. And in the case of hydrogen, it's very interesting talking about the solar panels. The communities around this project that didn't have access to power in some cases, they actually negotiated with the companies that are developing the hydrolyzers to produce hydrogen, is that they were not going to allow this project to happen in their territories unless they were going to have access to power. Therefore, they needed to be a part of the distribution system just to make sure that they got electricity as well. So, as I said, this is a very dynamic process where, and at the same time, the negotiation skills of the communities has become a lot stronger than it used to be. The other development in the area is really the role, talking about China, that has become very, very significant in the region. And that's very interesting, again, based on what Michelle was saying, that the US used to have the capacity to process the minerals. But that changed. The communities in the US were not interested in having these processing plants close by. Therefore, they left the country or they shut down. On the other hand, China has become the major processing country for copper and lithium, as well as other critical minerals. So I did a policy briefing some years ago, where I could see clearly that all of a sudden, all the exports of copper and lithium, rather than coming to the US and going to Europe and even to Korea, to South Korea, they were all going to China. So that has been the result of the fact that they have developed the skills and the capacity and the training, despite the fact that the local countries, in the case of Chile and Argentina and Peru, they really want to have a bigger participation in the processing, in the value added of the processing of their product. But that, as I said, has not been happening because of the cost and the technologies required to actually do that. So they have not, so far they haven't been successful in increasing, I guess, the value added in their production of these critical minerals. So in conclusion, I guess, I could say that assessing the risks and the impact that the mining operations have is very, very significant. And the whole concept of incorporating the thinking and the participation of the local communities and the indigenous communities in particular that have been living in the territories where many of these these minerals and reserves are located is also absolutely essential. I think that's what I would say at this time. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions from the audience here, please, sir?
Yes, thanks to all the presenters. Michelle was very good at listing off a whole range of impacts, many unfavorable, occasional favorable ones. And I know our convener, Rachel, is very big on writing and mentioning thinking full cycle, cradle to grave. And our first speaker, it sounded to me, in dealing with her association members, was really describing something almost like a value-added tax that they were going to participate, the members were going to participate with an association. Since we're not undersupplied with economists here, how do y'all feel that approaches like carbon fee and dividend or similar, how far might they go to addressing some of the issues that we have with all of these sustainability considerations? Thank you.
Take first crack.
Yeah, so there are, I'll say a couple of things. There are several ways of pricing carbon. through the supply chain. A couple of problems. One of them concerns the so-called carbon leakage problem. When once you impose carbon whatever kind of tax in one region, things can just move across the border or wherever convenient in order to avoid that tax. Some of that we saw in Europe when carbon taxes were imposed, energy-intensive industries like cement, for example, or some metallurgical even plants would move to North Africa, for example, to avoid this. So you have to take into consideration and then just import back. So you have to take that into consideration when you design the system. Another thing about carbon in particular, as you know very well, is that it's a global problem. So the policies, and that's what's making it so challenging. There has to be and this has become sort of almost dirty words these days, but there has to be global coordination. Sticking within your borders and but even within your borders, if you try to solve the problem within your borders, and Europe is trying, for example, very hard, but it's just too small and too clean already to make a difference. So this international coordination, if we were talking about local pollutants, like SOx, NOx, things like that, or some of the other externalities that Michelle mentioned, these are created locally and can be solved locally. But you mentioned carbon, and that's really tough to resolve through this. Now, other measures that have taken place involve carbon credits. You didn't mention that, but it's something that's discussed a lot these days. Big amount of carbon washing, unfortunately, has been taking place in that space. Once again, it's a global challenge, and we need global standards and global verification methods. So when people claim that they can, credits that are, that they deserve, that this is actually something that we can verify, that mechanism, unfortunately, is missing. Not very optimistic about this when it comes to carbon in particular. Other externalities that are more local in nature, I think pricing mechanisms like what you mentioned could be more effective.
Michelle or Benigna, did you have anything you wanted to add on that one?
I dare Peter or Ted, or both, to disagree that, first of all, you can design approaches that might be more efficient, but there are costs that are going to get allocated across societies. Would y'all disagree with that? Nothing is cost-free. So it doesn't matter whether it's a carbon tax, a carbon fee, credit program of some sort, or tariffs, which I think carbon border adjustments are basically tariffs. Every one of those approaches is going to become sooner or later reflected in the cost of the good or the service, right? So I think, the global conversation is really, what are people really willing to pay for to fix something that is, as Peter said the other day in another meeting, and you didn't say it today, but you should have, so uncertain. The cones of uncertain are so wide around everything that we're talking about that it makes it really tough to think about this in a I think a good way.
Please.
Words in Ted's mouth, but I think he was saying these schemes may not actually be efficient either. It's also true there will be distributional implications, but his point is if you do some of these kinds of schemes locally, that they won't be efficient either.
Please.
So now we have nothing.
So, Michelle, actually, you touched upon a very important point, carbon being used as carbon. Because we have problems with CO2, even carbon monoxide, those are pollutants. But what if we think about carbon used as carbon, as the material of construction? And we have seen that used in various places. That's a very durable and hard material, but the technology in demonstration scale has not, or in scaled up form has not progressed. I think time has come to think about that because there is abundance of carbon. If you think about natural gas, for example, we in Texas, we have no dearth of natural gas. If you can split it into carbon and hydrogen, those are infinite sources and valuable resources. So we need to think about that. We need to advance the technology to the demonstration scale and to the final stage of utilizing those. So is there any thought about that? And you mentioned that Rice University has the researcher who came up with the science. So I think why not we think about advancing those technologies. Thank you.
So Matteo, you're going to talk about the Carbon Hub, right? So I'm going to kick the can. I'm going to kick the can to Matteo, but let me say this. So what the Rice Carbon Hub, which Matteo will describe, funded 2 projects within the Center for Energy Studies. One that I ran that looked at the potential for displacing metals with carbon nanotube fiber products. I have become such a fan of this that it's all I think about these days, to tell you the truth. And I think the possibilities are much larger than we even among ourselves have talked about. But to your points, the scale-up challenges and other things. But let's take an example of something that came up earlier with regard to the Middle East and these carbon-rich economies. For the past 3 years, we've been watching this intense economic diversification effort that their sovereign funds are financing to try to move the economies into the same path that everybody else is heading in. So let's become supply hubs for metals and battery materials in order to diversify our economies for the day when our oil is no longer going to be as valuable as it is. And yet here they are sitting on the most valuable thing of all, which is elemental carbon, right? And so what we see are the sets of choices out there that aren't getting articulated very well, I think, in terms of what people really could do. But I'm going to leave it to Matteo to talk about, more deeply what the thinking has been around here related to all of that.
Please.
I wanted to perhaps shift the focus now and address some comments of Benigna about the indigenous communities. And it's a comment, it's not a question. I wanted to highlight that indigenous populations are important in the materials future, not because they stop our developments, or they could stop, production. I think indigenous people are important because of their own. I mean, they are part of us. So human rights implies that we are all, part of this. And I want to raise this issue because, for example, the big sink of carbon that we have in, for example, the jungles, like in the Brazilian forest, etc., may require some economic new solutions to keep those untouched, and have them as carbon sinks, because this cannot be only the responsibility of Brazil, for example. In my view, it has to be like a cooperation that is a cooperation for economics, environment, but also, yes, people, which are the indigenous people living there, which we respect. It's just a comment. Perhaps I wanted to pick your minds about that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. People live there, therefore you have to respect that this is their, they have been living there long before, and the Europeans arrive in this continent. So this is really to respect their ancestors and the fact that they own their territories. So you have, but at the same time, the economic development of the region requires to work with them, because they are not the drivers of the economic development. They're not the investors. So you really need to make sure that you work with them and take into consideration their needs and their thinking.
I think some of the situations too, because I say this as somebody who grew up out in the Permian Basin oil field and has dealt with landowners in other contexts, is if you have a really concentrated resource, you actually see some really interesting case studies where indigenous groups have been able to do pretty well. You think of the Osage tribe in Oklahoma. You think of, the Hickory Apache in New Mexico, the Ute tribe in Utah and Colorado. But where it's something where things are more spread out and diffuse, like to your Amazon example, those are way more challenging because it's something, if you have something where benefits are more concentrated, it's often, I think, easier to negotiate a solution. When it's something that is spread out, you start to run into some of the tragedy of the commons type of situations. But also, to Benigna's point, there's still people that live there, and you're trying to balance this with development, and those are the ones where there's not easy answers, and it's kind of a case by case thing where there's a lot of diplomacy and work that'll have to go into it. I don't know if you had.
On the plus side, a couple of trends. One is to bring local communities, community-based groups, indigenous groups, into the projects on an equity basis. That is evolving, getting shaped, sometimes in questionable ways. I mean, they have to be able to do it, right? I mean, this is sort of the reality of it. The second thing that's been happening, and this is harder because not every company is able to do the same thing, but there's a notion of regional development approaches. So if you're planning a mining project, or any project, an oil and gas project, whatever it is, that is going to require roads, transportation, rail, ports and harbors, electric power of any sort, fuels, diesel, whatever. And what you have to think about is how, when you do that, the long-term benefits get developed, and then the longevity of those assets beyond the life of the project, or that particular endeavor. And so there's a lot of effort to try to rethink this, but we're just in the very beginning stages. I mean, it's like I said, you're talking about industries that tend to historically be boom bust, very much price takers. It's difficult to do these things, but people are trying.
And I think you've got to be really transparent. Like, what you don't want are situations, I don't know how many of you in here have watched There Will Be Blood, the great scene where Daniel Day-Lewis is telling him it's, that's part of Texas we're from, but yeah, where he's telling these folks there in coastal California, we just want this for quail hunting. It's like, no, you want to drill for oil and build a pipeline. The transparency, to Michelle's point, like, if you treat somebody more like a partner, like if I'm coming in with equipment to your land, you're probably going to be inclined pretty fast to hate me. But like, if it's like, hey, let's be business partners, and there's stuff that's presented to you and you're able to go hire your own counsel and actually get it looked at to see if it's legitimate, maybe we can't work something out, but if we do, it sets up a whole different type of environment.
Yeah,
There are
I'm sorry.
some models, for example, in Colombia, I have worked with some independent oil and gas companies who in fact take care of the suppliers for a matter of human rights, and they train them and they are part of the business, not because they share the profits, but because they provide resources.
The services.
Yes, the services, which is a very interesting model, and they gain from that.
You're still sharing opportunity.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, and in addition to that, you can actually, in some cases, you actually train them. You're not only employing these people, but you are actually training them. So when the project is over, because this is a depleted asset, when they have other opportunities, because they have already been trained.
But you can contrast that to Ted's point about efficiencies and approaches with an enforced local content rule, which usually is abused, usually never gets you the results that you want. And so, being able to make the right decisions, politically agnostic, which is, how do you get that? But at any rate,
Did you have anything else, Ted? I think we're coming up on time. One quick question, because we're coming up on time, so you'll be the last one.
Sure. I'd like to tie in the financial side to this equation. When you look at any capital project, mining is a capital-intensive project. In the United States, we have brownfield, brown miles that are attracting some interest. The greenfield is getting a lot of resistance because you have to infuse a lot of capital. But doing my research on critical minerals and all that, I realized for the lithium batteries in the U.S., the biggest source of lithium in the market is recycling. With that background that I mentioned, what is attracting the appetite of the financial market and investors? Because I've seen a lot of companies, they have a great idea on the mining side, they become a publicly traded company overnight, and then they go through the motion and they collapse because of the political issues and the regulatory issues and the community issues. Not just from indigenous people, but also in the United States, you have ranchers who are resisting the development or redevelopment of these mines. So if I take it back to the financial side, do you guys follow the signals from the financial side and seeing where they're investing, or if there is an appetite to give us an idea whether mining is feasible here in the United States?
So everybody's favorite answer, at least on the metal side, but increasingly on the plastic side, is recycling. A recycler is a price taker just like a mining operator is. So it's really tough. It is really, really hard. There are lots and lots and lots of ideas about how to recover metals from complex instruments like batteries. There's a lot yet to be learned. One thing that needs to stop happening, to be blunt, is problems with black mass facilities. So what we do is we collect battery waste. The battery waste gets disaggregated, and then it gets converted into through or other processes. And it's very unstable material. The processes are very unstable, and facilities need to be operating without incident. And there are too many of those going on right now. So there's something about that cycle of capture of battery waste and the handling of battery waste and the conversion of battery waste that needs work. That said, we've got a faculty colleague here who's coming up with ways of using high heat, what we call flash joule, to break down materials, to plastics to graphene, battery waste into the component materials, coal ash to extract the rare earths, and so on and so forth. And those things can be done. You have to have the value proposition associated with it.
Well, excellent. On that note, it's been a pleasure to be with you, and even more of a pleasure to be with all of you out here with your wonderful questions. Let's give our panelists a hand. Thank you.
Sorry about the technical glitches.
I think we're going to quickly swap out.